South Africa has reported its worst economic slump in more than 100 years. The country was already in recession when the pandemic hit, and in that weakened state, it was unable to control an outbreak that quickly became the worst in the region. But the government is hopeful its vaccination rollout can turn the economy's prospects around. Paolo Montecillo reports.
The past year has put immense strain on South African healthcare workers. They've had to deal with more than 1.5 million coronavirus cases, which have led to 50,000 deaths.
So last year, I know a lot of my colleagues who had suffered from burnout, and that is just, one of the inevitable outcomes of this disease on us as healthcare workers as well. And to be honest, I went through that myself as well.
Africa's worst coronavirus outbreak has also taken a heavy toll on the continent's most industrialized economy. South African GDP shrank 7% last year due to lockdowns meant to slow the spread of the virus. It was the country's first annual contraction since 2009 and its worst performance in a century. That's despite the easing of social distancing restrictions that helped boost growth to more than 6% in the final 3 months of 2020. The government reimposed strict lockdowns at the end of last year to battle a more contagious strain of COVID-19, which was first identified in South Africa. As a result, the infection rate has slowed, paving the way for the easing of restrictions at the start of this month.
New infections, admissions to hospitals and deaths have fallen significantly and continue to decline steadily.
But the government says South Africa's best route to recovery is through vaccination. The rollout began last month, and officials aim to immunize the majority of the population by the end of the year. That would help nurse the economy back to health and give the nation's medical workers a much-needed break. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more, let's go to Gracelin Baskaran in Johannesburg. She's an economist and senior research fellow at the University of Cape Town. Welcome to the program, Gracelin. Can I start with that headline figure, a 7% contraction in 2020, the worst slump since 1920. Was that all about the pandemic and that strict lockdown that we saw at the beginning of the outbreak last year and then again towards the end of last year?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. So that's a great question. So the economic growth narrative of South Africa precedes the pandemic. In 2020, GDP contracted by 7%, but that came after growth rates of 0.2% and 0.8% in the preceding 2 years. So we weren't in great shape before the pandemic even began. And over the last decade, we have not had consistently high growth rates over 3% like we did in the early 2000s. So structural challenges such as electricity, land reform, declining infrastructure investment, and the uncertainty arising from policy challenges like the mining charter contributed to low growth over the last decade. And this was further exacerbated by political challenges such as state capture and other irregularities. So 2018 and 19 were slow years before the pandemic even began. So if we look at Q4 of last year, it was really kind of a good summary of all of 2020. The pandemic hit, load shedding was present, and businesses had to close to contain the pandemic while unemployment challenges deepened. And the only productive sector that grew in 2020 was agriculture, which grew about 13% year on year. And every other productive sector of the economy contracted. But what we did see, like you noted, was that between Q3 and Q4, we saw positive movement. So 8 out of 10 industries recorded growth, with manufacturing, catering and accommodation, transport, storage, and communication recording the highest growth. And these were some of the hardest hit industries during the pandemic and absolutely contributed to this 7% annual contraction.
Can I ask you more about one of those underlying issues that you mentioned, and that's power generation, which, as we know, is crucial in all aspects of life, including industry and the economy. Eskom, which is the state power provider, was basically crippled in December 2 years ago when some of its aging power plants broke down. That led to a series of rolling blackouts that not only hit households but also businesses and all aspects of the economy for hours at a time. Is that issue, power generation, something that's so basic to any society, is that being looked at by the government? What do they plan to do about that?
Absolutely. So it's definitely an ongoing challenge. And if we actually look at sectors like the mining sector, which is the biggest user of electricity, it is regularly cited as one of the biggest challenges in terms of the costs imposed. So one of the more recent policy decisions, for example, the mining sector, was now allowing mining firms to generate their own electricity. So in that move, the government is acknowledging that it is a constraint to economic growth and that it is important in a way to let the private sector generate energy in their own way outside of the Eskom grid to ensure that there is that element of competitiveness with other countries and to increase growth in these areas.
Well, things do seem to be looking up, though, because as we heard in Paolo's story, in the last quarter, we did see growth continue building on that extraordinary rebound that we saw in the third quarter. What's your outlook on the South African economy? Can it continue this momentum?
So growth estimates for 2021 are between 3 and 4%. But it's important to note that this isn't necessarily remarkable, given that we're coming from a low base in 2020. With this contraction of 7%. And this growth rate is lower than other key emerging markets and BRICS countries. So China is forecasted to grow by about 8.1% and India by 11.5%. So relative to other key markets, growth is still slower. But the country is likely to remain open, and the agriculture sector is set to grow on the back of a lot of rainfall, the mining sector on the back of increasing commodity prices. But one thing that will continue to hinder growth is that total real fixed investment has declined by 17% year on year. And this includes both public sector investment and private sector investment. And this is unlikely to improve without the structural reforms that we discussed earlier, because if we can implement some of these reforms, it's likely to translate to an increase in investor confidence. But on the bright side, to support this growth narrative, the vaccine rollout and massive stimulus in the US is actually likely to stimulate demand for South African exports. And on the consumption side, household spending growth will increase, obviously off of a very low base this year. And low interest rates and subdued inflation will also help economic growth. One of the things that we do expect to see is that weak job market and slow income growth will remain pervasive. And a spike in infections, especially as we're entering winter in the Southern Hemisphere, could trigger stronger lockdown restrictions. We don't know when the economy will recover, but given the pre-pandemic slow growth that had been kind of mounting for a decade and the structural challenges, we think that we're likely to see, 2019 economic activity levels return in 2024, unless we see an implementation of, structural reforms to accelerate recovery.
Okay, Gracelin Baskaran in Johannesburg. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for bringing us your analysis. Thank you.